still in a meditative mode, let's do a little bit of a contemplative meditation to set our motivation. So for that, we kind of contemplate first, just a sense of gratitude and appreciation for being alive today, sitting here with a human body, a human brain. Because actually having this, time, right? Time, being alive is worth more than $1 million or than $1 billion. The most precious thing we have is time while we're alive. With this kind of human mind that can think, so we have so much freedom to contemplate, to understand things, to develop ourselves. And we have every kind of situation, being in a country where that's possible, being in a time period when that's possible, when teachings exist that allow us to understand ourselves better, understand our own nature, develop positive emotions, and so on. So we kind of feel I'm so lucky, so fortunate, so grateful. Despite, whatever difficulties, I'm here. Alive, breathing, thinking, sitting. And from a Buddhist perspective, this life that we have right now, for inner development, for spiritual development, is the most useful. That you yourself have the best possible life form, the best kind of body, brain, mind, and situation for spiritual progress. So you yourself have a very, very precious opportunity just from being alive. So we try to develop a feeling of appreciating our life, appreciating this day, a sense of joy, appreciation, and gratitude for this day. We recognize this life won't last forever. It's absolutely certain that I'm going to die someday. Right? Everybody dies. It's the nature of this kind of life that it ends. Right? And there's not much time for spiritual practice. And the time of my death is not at all certain. If I look around, people are dying every day. Some of them younger, some of them older, and some my same age. So the point of that is to think. So I want to take the essence of my life. I want to make my life in general, and then this day, particularly as meaningful as possible. So I have this amazing gift of time right now, and I want to make the best use possible. So the best use I can make what's the best way to use this life, this day? Actually, the Buddha himself said it's Bodhichitta. So we can say simply compassion. So we resolved that, since I have this precious opportunity, which won't last, which is brief, which is fleeting. My life and everybody else's lives are brief and fleeting. So then I'll make use of it with compassion. Compassion for myself and compassion for others. So compassion starts with compassion for ourselves, also for our friends and family, for strangers, even for enemies. So the purpose of my life, my purpose for today, is to live with a sense of compassion, trying to alleviate the suffering of myself and all others. You can think so. Also, this day, and then especially for this next little bit of time while we're discussing together, right? My motivation is compassion, to gain some little bit of understanding, insight, or experience, in order to be more useful to myself, more useful to others, and alleviating suffering, and bringing happiness. My ultimate purpose is to achieve enlightenment, so I can be most effective in benefiting others. That Bodhichitta wish to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient. So we try to kind of infuse this sense or idea or feeling of compassion, kind of mixing our mind with a sense of compassion for ourselves and compassion for others. Letting that kind of quality pervade our listening, our discussing, meditating, so that we're living with a good heart, a positive mind. So we can come into more interactive modes to discuss actually Bodhichitta. So this is like the first in a series of I guess classes discussing Bodhichitta. How to cultivate bodhicitta, is that what it's called? I forget on the website, something like that. But so I just thought it makes sense to start with. So what, makes sense to start with what is bodhicitta, right? Like, if we're trying to cultivate something, you have to know what it is. That makes sense. So actually, first of all, like the word bodhi and bodhicitta. Let's start with that, right? So. I'll actually start with the reverse. So chitta is a Sanskrit word. Right? So chitta means mind, right? And one thing I'll say though is, I think it's an important distinction that we translate it as mind usually, but in this context, like in the West, we have this idea of mind and heart being separated, right? Like Thomas Jefferson wrote that letter, the conflict between my mind and my heart, which is a common theme. Those aren't separate. There's the idea, like, so that there's not a sense of actually like a. In other words, if you ask, ordinarily if you say to a Tibetan, where is the mind, they'll say here, right? Same with the Indian, practice, right? In other words, the seed of the, so ordinarily we have the sense of dualism, I think, between mind and heart. There's not, so the word chitta doesn't suggest that dualism, so just saying when I say mind, it means also heart, in that sense. Right? And then bodhi is the same root as bud, like Buddha, right? So, and it means technically awake, right, or enlightened. So in this context, like you could call it like an awakening, right? Because bodhi, in this sense, is not already enlightened, but is a mind that's waking up, right? Or a mind that's seeking enlightenment, or a heart that's seeking enlightenment, or a heart that's waking up. So technically, if you just translate the words, it means something like that. But then, but so actually, like to understand what bodhicitta really is, though, that's not enough, really. Like that's what the words mean, but then to understand the real meaning of it. So the technical definition from like Maitreya, who's actually pictured there, the Buddha of love, that statue's of Maitreya. In one of his texts, he said he defined bodhicitta as the wish to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And so I just thought to kind of explain a little bit what that really means so that we have a full context, right? And so actually, if you think about, like, so first of all, like, to develop bodhicitta, first it's grounded in love and compassion. Does that make sense? So obviously, right, that's the ground for bodhicitta. And in some ways, from a Buddhist perspective, bodhicitta is the ultimate expression of love and compassion. So first, like, and ordinarily one first cultivates love, right? And there are actually two types of love. There are many types of love, but there are two types, particularly in Buddhist psychology, that they talk about cultivating. So one is affectionate love, right? A sense of warmth towards others, which is like they say often is the feeling that a mother has for a child. That feeling of warmth, or the child has for their parent, for example. A young child might have for the mom. And then there's another kind of love that grows out of that. That's like the wish for others to be happy. Right? So usually, ordinarily, first comes the warm feeling, right? That feeling of affection, and then comes an actual wish: may they be happy. And then compassion goes a little bit. Compassion grows out of love, actually, psychologically. But compassion's, in a sense, even stronger than love, because compassion is the wish that others be free from suffering. And the reason why compassion, they're both positive states of mind, obviously, right? Love and compassion. But the difference, actually, you can see it. Like if you look at in everyday life, you'll see what I mean. Like in other words, like let's say with a friend, right? Like wanting your friend to be happy and say, oh, let's go to a game together, or let's hang out together. Like you want them to be happy. But that's different than like when a friend is really suffering who shows up, right? There's a difference there. So you can see how one is stronger than the other, right? Like you may have quite a few friends who would show up, if there was some like a happy occasion, right? But how many would show up when you were really having a hard time and be there for you, right? Because that's grounded in compassion. So you see, it's a deeper feeling of connection with the other person and a deeper commitment. Does that make sense, kind of? So both are positive, but compassion is willing to face the suffering of the other and be present and try to alleviate that. Right? So it takes a little bit more strength. It takes a little bit more like bravery, actually, right, to practice compassion than it does to practice loving kindness. Although they're both positive, and actually, from a Buddhist psychological point of view, compassion grows out of love. Right? So first you develop love and affection for somebody, and then eventually it becomes compassion. So actually, actually, I'll start with this. So Shantideva, in his Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, right, where he's teaching about bodhicitta, he says actually that just ordinary compassion, wishing one person to be free from a headache, right, is first of all a positive thing that doesn't happen every day. Right? Like there was a So he points out that even that is quite good, right? And then he contrasts that with the Bodhisattva. He says, so Shantideva says, it's quite positive, right? Just wishing that others be free from small sufferings is quite positive. But then when one is trying to cultivate bodhicitta, one cultivates first a sense of loving affection for all beings. Right? That's not yet bodhicitta, actually. That's like before. That's long. One cultivate that long before one develops bodhicitta. In other words, it's a process, right? But so imagine that, right? Imagine cultivating a sense of loving affection and warmth towards all beings, right? And that means not just the people you like, but also people who you find difficult. Right? That means also like all strangers, but also not just humans, right? So one cultivates that sense of loving affection for all living creatures. And then one cultivates compassion towards all living creatures. So a kind of universal compassion, right? Wishing all beings everywhere to be free from suffering. And then one cultivates what's called at that point. Actually, I don't know if some of you who know, we've talked about this before in some classes. There's like different like scopes of Buddhism, right? So there's the vehicle of individual liberation, and then the Mahayana, the great vehicle, right? So actually, universal compassion is still something that people on the individual liberation vehicle cultivate. And so somebody who's not striving to become a Buddha still cultivates universal compassion. So there's a unique quality that bodhisattvas who are trying to become Buddhas that comes after universal compassion. And the Dalai Lama sometimes calls it the unique attitude of universal responsibility. Right? The Dalai Lama often uses that term, universal responsibility. In Tibetan there's this term, it's called laksam, which means like unusual attitude. And it's unusual or special in the sense that only bodhisattvas cultivate it. Only somebody who's trying to become a bodhisattva cultivates it. And it's an attitude that says, not only do I cultivate love and compassion for all beings, but I cultivate a sense of that the purpose of my existence is to benefit others. The very purpose of my existence is that, and it's my responsibility. Does that make sense? So it's like the difference, just to give a psychological example here, it's like the difference, if somebody walks by and sees a child crying, if you're walking by and you see a child crying at the swimming pool or something, right? You might have a wish of compassion. Oh, I wish they wouldn't. I wish they'd be okay. I wish they would not have to suffer. Right? But then you might just keep walking, right? Whereas if you're their parent, right, then you don't just think, oh, may they be. I hope they're okay, right? You rush over to help. So there's a difference psychologically between, you see what I mean? Like between sort of saying, gosh, I wish everyone could be free from suffering, and saying, I take the responsibility to free others from suffering. Right? So those are two different attitudes. So what Shantideva says, right, when he's talking about the nature of bodhicitta, is he says, he points out, he says, who else in the world but a bodhisattva has that kind of attitude? Right? Like the attitude that even unasked, right, they strive to benefit all sentient beings. Right? Even unasked, they don't just want to take away a headache, but they want to free everyone from all their sorrows. Right? So that's the unusual attitude. And then when somebody develops that unusual attitude, then they think, well, in my current state, can I benefit all sentient beings? Can I free all sentient beings? And they realize, I can't even free if somebody's first developing bodhicitta, what they think is, well, actually, I can't even free myself from suffering, much less all beings. So they develop the wish to achieve full enlightenment or Buddhahood in order to fulfill that aspiration. Right? So to become the best possible, most skillful version of somebody who can help others, they develop the wish for enlightenment. So then that becomes what Maitreya was saying, right? So then the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. So I'm just describing a little bit how you develop it to describe what bodhicitta is, right? So it's grounded in the sense of universal love, universal compassion, unusual personal responsibility, and then this wish for enlightenment. So that's just describing what is bodhicitta. And then I thought to just say a little bit about, because usually one starts with this actually, and it's a good way to start, I think, is so what are the benefits of bodhicitta? In other words, so like why is it helpful? And so I'll say a few things about that. Like one is, one thing I actually liked that Lama Yeshe said was that, there are some Buddhist teachings that might be like culturally difficult, depending on what culture you're from or something like that, but that the teachings, that there is a teaching on compassion is universal, right? And there is it doesn't matter if you're Buddhist or not Buddhist. It doesn't matter if you're from the East or the West or North or South, right? In other words, if you think and feel and look honestly at your own and others' situations, then clearly compassion and empathy are good things, right? Whereas when you look at the suffering in the world, that's everywhere, actually, right? Whereas the suffering of rich people and of poor people, of old people and young people and middle-aged people, then there's no doubt that actually compassion is a good thing, right? So it becomes clear that, and that actually, in other words, I think anybody can see, actually, right? You can't really go wrong with cultivating compassion. And then I'll add a few more thoughts on this, right? Like, so also, actually, in Buddhist psychology, in the Buddhist psychological teachings, one thing that's really explained very clearly is how selfishness, self-centeredness, right, is the cause of all suffering in the world, whereas compassion and love are the causes of happiness. And so, actually, if we look around, right, so because bodhicitta is the ultimate way of overcoming selfishness, right, and cultivating loving kindness and compassion. And so if you look around in the world, right, actually it's quite easy to see, right, what's the cause, like if you look at all the wars that are happening and have happened in the world, then for sure they come from selfishness, right, so like from selfishness, and also in this particular sense, right, of what's the word, cherishing one's own, one sense of I and mine, right, me, my stuff, my family's good, your family's bad, right? My country's good, your country's bad. My well-being is important, your well-being's not important, right? That kind of attitude, right, is definitely, right, if you look at the history of any war, it starts with that. Somebody's idea that their well-being is much more important than others' well-being. And actually, and also, I just saw the other day a quote where I think it was Martin Luther King Jr. was pointing out that that especially in this era, right, in the modern time, poverty is also caused by that. Right? There were other times where you could say, okay, if there was a drought in one area, it was like there wasn't much that could happen, because there wasn't transportation. But now the world is so interdependent, right? If people are starving or in severe poverty, right, it's because of self. Because the world is this interdependent, actually, right? Because there is enough food, actually. So the point there, the point I'm getting at is this: is actually, if you look on a global level, right, the problems between countries, problems between groups within a country, like political problems, right, is from a lack of compassion and warmth towards each other. Then also the problems within families, right? Like the problems between children and their parents, or between husbands and wives, right? Between other relatives, like when there are family arguments, right? If you look honestly, everybody can check your own history, right? Look at the families and so on. And you can see actually, right? It's because somebody was being a little too self-centered. Right? The problems between friends, same thing. So also then, actually our own problems, right? When we're like insecure and worried, right? When we're depressed and so on, right? It's rooted in this kind of self-preoccupation, right? When we're worried about things, there is that we're not able to kind of open our hearts and be in the present moment and be open to others. It's not to blame ourselves, but it's actually, even that is grounded in this kind of habit of self-grasping and kind of self-centeredness. So cultivating bodhicitta overcomes all those problems. So actually, as soon as a person develops bodhicitta, then they no longer create those kind of problems, right? So in other words, as soon as somebody develops bodhicitta, then, or even if before that, if one just develops a sense of extreme altruism, right? Like the Dalai Lama often points this out, when people say, well, how can we create peace, right? And Dalai Lama says the peace has to begin within, right? Whereas if an individual person creates a sense of compassion for others, then they're no longer contributing, right? Because if you just actually, because if you look at it, it's true. I mean, what Dalai Lama is saying is quite true, right? Whereas if somebody goes out saying, I want to stop war, right? And then they start protesting against somebody else who's creating a war, right? And then they become very angry at the person who they think is creating the war. Well, and then that person's angry at them, and they're angry at that person, right? Well, they're actually doing the same thing, right? In other words, they're doing the same thing. So now the person who, like, if you think, oh, this person's causing conflict, so I'm angry at them, right? But then that person was angry at somebody else, and that was what caused the conflict to begin with. So you're actually adding to the cycle of aggression. Right? So actually, the solution to that is not to not protest. That's up to you. You protest or don't. It's not the behavioral thing. What we're saying is that internally, right, a sense of love and compassion and patience, right, and commitment and energy, right? It's not saying to be passive, but it's saying to be active in a compassionate, loving, patient, strong-minded way. Right? So actually, if we want to contribute to world peace, then development of love and compassion is the best thing we can do. Right? If we want to have more peaceful relationships with our own family, then developing love and compassion is the best thing we can do. If we want to have better friendships, right, and have more friends and have an easier time with our friends, then ourselves creating a sense of love and compassion is the best thing we can do. And oftentimes people think, well, the other person should develop love and compassion, right? That's our ordinary attitude. We say, yes, love and compassion are good. That person should be more loving to me. That's our ordinary attitude. If they were more loving, everything would be much better. Right? But actually, what Buddhist psychology is saying is it has to start with you, right? There is as long as you're thinking somebody else should do that, then it's complete. Like actually, that is self-centeredness, right? Whereas I shouldn't have to do it; they should do it. Is self-centeredness, right? Whereas when you develop the sense of I'll be that way, right? And then of course others will be more. Actually, like because if you don't find others to be loving and kind in your life, right? What Buddhist teaching is saying is that ultimately, if you practice love and compassion enough, right, over time, then your life will have more of that in it. Right? And that's obvious, right? In other words, if you go around being aggressive, what's going to happen in your life? Right? Whereas if you walk around being angry and aggressive to others, right? Well, eventually others are going to be annoyed at you, right? And they're going to be angry and aggressive to you, right? If you treat others with love and respect and kindness, right, then of course your life will have more of that. So actually, just developing this sense of love, compassion, altruism, you can start to see how it's the cause of happiness. Actually, right? You have better relationships. You have better, family relationships. You have a life of more meaning, right? You immediately then you start contributing to the world in a positive way. Right? On the other hand, if you don't do that, even if you think you want to make a difference, actually you may be making things worse, not better. So then also I want to add a few comments from a Buddhist perspective on the benefit. Those are just general points, but then from a uniquely Buddhist perspective, right? They say that the development of bodhicitta, right, is the beginning point where one becomes a bodhisattva. So as soon as you develop bodhicitta, you become a bodhisattva, right? Which is somebody, and actually Shantideva in this Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, he says, somebody who develops bodhicitta becomes a child of the Buddhas. So what the meaning there is not that one literally one's literal biological parents, obviously, but it means that you're in the process of becoming that. Does that make sense? So, like, in other words, the moment in that sense, right, that you're going to grow up to be a Buddha, because that's the main cause of enlightenment. And then also, like, ordinarily, like, it can be difficult to know if we're practicing. Like, in other words, if you just base it on behavior. Right? Behavior is not the way to tell if you're practicing Buddhism, actually, right? Whereas you could be doing like prostrations or sitting like this or whatever, and that doesn't mean you're practicing Buddhism, actually, right? Because somebody could be sitting like this but be feeling a sense of feeling angry, right? And just cultivating anger. Well, they did this to me and they did that to me. That's not meditation. That's just anger. A person could be like doing some kind of other spiritual practice and be thinking, oh, how wonderful I am, I do more of this than everybody else, aren't I special? That's not spiritual practice, actually. That's just the same as any, in other words, like if you're doing that, in other words, from a Buddhist perspective, the appearance is not what matters. Right, so even if like you put on robes and shaved your head or, and then like went to pilgrimages or something like that, actually from a Buddhist perspective, that's not spiritual practice in and of itself. That makes sense? Spiritual practice means that you're decreasing your negative emotional states, your anger, your pride, your jealousy, your arrogance, your ignorance, your craving, right? And that you're developing positive emotional state, positive states of mind like love, compassion, altruism, patience, joy, and so on. And so actually, if you don't cultivate bodhicitta, sometimes it's quite difficult to tell, am I even practicing any spiritual practice, right? Or you could be going through the motions or something. But if somebody's developing love and compassion, then there's no doubt, right? They're automatically become everything. And actually, I'll say this too, it's quite interesting. If you don't develop these kinds of minds, right, of bodhicitta, then you could spend a lot of time seeming to do spiritual things and not be doing any spiritual practice. On the other hand, if you do cultivate bodhicitta, like that, this kind of mind, then even if you appear to be doing ordinary activities, like from a Buddhist perspective, we say that's spiritual, right? So you could just be going to work, but if you're going to work feeling, right, like one person could be sitting at home, like in a retreat like this, right? But if they're thinking, oh, everybody should notice how wonderful I am, they're not doing in that moment a spiritual practice. On the other hand, somebody else, if they develop this mind of bodhicitta, right, then even if they're going to work, but if they're going to work feeling, I'm going to work to be of benefit and service. Then they're with their family, but they're feeling, I'm here to be of benefit and service. I'm here to practice love and compassion, to strive for enlightenment, right? So I'm being kind to my cousin or my aunt or my uncle with a sense of altruism, wishing I could be kind to all beings, like that. Then they're doing actual spiritual practice, right? So you can't tell from the external appearance. Does that make sense? So in other words, we can't judge somebody else's spiritual practice from the outer signs. It's only on that inner level. But for ourselves, we can definitely say, if we're cultivating love, compassion, altruism, and bodhicitta, then we're doing the highest form of spiritual practice, whatever our external activity is. If we're not, then it's hard to tell if we're doing anything particularly meaningful. And then also, I guess I'm basing this on Shantideva. Shantideva says, he gives this analogy, and I want to kind of explain it. He says, among the virtuous actions, positive actions you can do, he says, he says something like, other ones are like there are certain, he uses these image of a tree, but I think a plantain tree or something that kind of produces fruit once and then dies and doesn't come back. But it's like in flowers, what's the difference between an annual and a perennial? I learned that, right? So a perennial always comes back, right? Whereas an annual blossoms once and then it's finished and doesn't come back. So I'm going to use that metaphor for a minute instead of the one. It's the same meaning as Shantideva's. He says you could say other virtues are like annual thing, right? In other words, it happens once, and then so you plant the seed and it ripens one time, and then it doesn't ripen again, right? So if you do a positive, this is talking about karma in a way, but what it's saying is like any positive act, right? So if you just do something out of a sense of kindness to somebody, that's a positive action, right? And so something positive happens, right? One is in the moment you feel a sense of positivity in doing that, the other person feels happy. And in karmic terms, it ripens once, right? You did something positive, so it'll ripen. But if you do something with bodhicitta, it's a totally different process. And I want to explain why, because I think this is, again, it just gets at something about the nature of what bodhicitta is. So it's this. Karma is controlled by or determined by your mind. Does that make sense? Your state of mind. That's why, for example, sometimes give examples like this, for example, if somebody, donates money to a cause, and their main motivation when they donate the money is, well, I want my name listed on the list of donors so everybody can see. And when people look at that list of donors, they say, oh, wow. And then I'll think, oh, great, they all noticed me. And then when they see me, I can walk a little like that and think, everybody should notice, right? So they would say that's not at all, first of all, it's not a spiritual thing, and it's not a positive karma, actually, right? Then there's the motivation behind that is arrogance, actually, right? Insecurity and arrogance. And they would say that, again, it's not to blame the person, but just say that's not a positive karma, because positive karma is determined by your mind, right? Whereas, if somebody does that same action, right, with the wish to help, and be of service to those people, then that's a positive action. But that's different than bodhicitta. So it's the extent of one's mind, right, that determines. And also I want to say that, so just to clarify that a little more too, so there's a difference between, for example, when they talk about karma, right? Whereas even with the same behavioral action, there's only somebody who, let's say, gets slightly annoyed and does an action, right? That's a negative karma, right? You're annoyed or angry and you do an action, that's not healthy, But then if somebody's totally enraged and filled with hatred, that's even more powerful. Makes sense, right? Like in other words, if you do the same action, and let's say two people are doing the same action, one's a little bit angry and the other is filled with hate. The person who's filled with hate is doing more negativity, even though the behavior may be the same, because it's their mind, right? That's more distorted, actually, and more is more actually that person's mind is more disturbed, right? The person who has more hatred, their mind is actually more disturbed. They're more filled with misery, actually, and destructiveness. Their motivation is worse, of really wishing to harm, right? And so they're creating, because karma is created by the mind, they're creating a kind of seed to continue experiencing the world in that way, right? As a world filled with hate. So with compassion and love, now we reverse that, right? So think about it this way, actually. So there is no other virtue as great as bodhicitta, and I'll explain why now. Like, in terms of the motivation, right? Even let's say the person, sometimes there's a traditional example they try to give an example of the smallest positive action. So they say giving a handful of food to an animal, right? Which is like a very small, just like one little handful. Right? So externally, that's a very small action. Right? So if the person is just doing that with a sense of if the person were doing that with an angry motivation, right? Like, if the person thinks, "Damn it, I didn't want to have to be the one to do this, but fine," that's not a positive action at all, right? Then, if the person is doing that with just a sense of, the animal will be hungry, so okay, fine, right? That's that's a very mild positive motivation, so it leads to a very small positive result. But then let's talk about bodhicitta, right? So there the person is feeling, right, that person who's the same, because, could be doing the same action, right? But the person who's practicing bodhicitta is feeling, right, they feel something like this, like that just as this animal suffers from hunger, all beings everywhere, right, in the universe suffer. Every animal, every human, every kind of being suffers. My wish, in the depths of my heart, my wish is I could alleviate the suffering of every being on every planet, every kind of being. Like, my entire being is infused with that wish that I could alleviate all that suffering. Right now, because of my limited circumstance, all I can do in this moment is feed this one animal. But by virtue of doing this, may I be able, may I cultivate myself so that eventually I can feed all beings. That everyone who's hungry, may I be able to give them food. Everyone who's thirsty, may I be able to give them water. Everyone who's friendless, may I be their friend. This is like what Shantideva describes, right? Everyone who is ignorant, may I teach them. And may I lead all beings out of suffering to happiness. And right now, what I can do is this, and by virtue of this, may I eventually be able to help others more, right? And then they feed that animal, and they say, by virtue of this, may I become enlightened to benefit all beings, leading this animal and all other beings to enlightenment. Right? So the motivation then is quite different, right? And I want to point out a couple of things in terms of karma. The idea there is this, one thing is, although the person's behavior is the same, their mind is not just aimed at one, it's aimed at compassion to all beings, which are infinite. Right? So then it becomes an infinite action. And then their goal is infinite, right? So first, their compassion is embracing an infinite number of beings. They're aiming at an infinite state, right? This kind of infinite state of full enlightenment. And then their goal is to benefit all those infinite beings as for them to be an infinite kind of creature, a Buddha, an infinite kind of being, and then to benefit all beings everywhere, right? So then it's an infinite motivation. Does that make sense? So the infinite motivation creates a different kind of relationship, which leads to a different kind of result. And so there Shantideva says, so that result continues to ripen again and again until they become actually a Buddha. And then also, I'll add one more, they also say that in terms of negative karma, right, that if you, that developing bodhicitta is the best way to purify negative karma. And that's clear too, because most of our negative karma, actually, if you think about it, most of the negative things you do are in relation to other people. Whereas you're impatient with people, you're rude to people, you're harsh with people, and so on. So by developing compassion for all beings, right, you're changing that relationship to others, and you begin to purify that, your negativity. And I'll just say one more point about this idea of bodhicitta. So actually, if you develop this kind of sense of altruism, right, and then love, compassion, altruism, and bodhicitta, actually it's quite interesting. The first person who benefits if you do that is you, actually, right? Whereas immediately you get peace of mind, right? You develop, like what happens is, actually, because you know, when somebody first develops this sense of altruism, actually they're not really able to help others that much. You know, they're still at the beginning of the path, right? So the first person who benefits is themselves, right? So the more you develop love and compassion, like Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, you know, real peace in your life, real happiness in your life begins when you begin to cherish others. Right? So immediately your mind becomes peaceful, right? And things don't upset you as much, and you feel more sense of meaning in your life, of contentment, of joy, of inner peace. And so actually this development of compassion and so on, actually first it benefits you, really. And then, you know, it starts to benefit the people immediately around you, right? Because you're not giving them, at least you're not giving them as hard a time as you were before. You're not quite as difficult to be around. Right? And then as you continue developing it, right, actually you benefit hugely, right? Your motivation is to help others, but actually it's you who benefit. In the early phases especially, it's you who benefit more. Others do benefit in the sense that you don't kill them as much or things like that, you know, like and harm them as much. But you're the main one who benefits actually early on. And then as you continue progressing, of course you start to benefit others more and more, right? You become, eventually that becomes possible. But, so actually by developing the sense of altruism, right, it's the best way to help yourself and help others, you know. Even if you want to have compassion for yourself, actually, like also the Dalai Lama used to joke. I don't know if he still makes that. Where he used to say, altruism. If you want to be selfish, be wisely selfish, right? And he said altruism is a wise form of selfishness because it helps you. You know, that was what he was getting at, right? So the Dalai Lama was getting at that. So even if you want to be selfish, actually, right? Actually, it's kind of that's like what's the word? That's like selfishness that undermines itself or something. Like, you know. I don't know, it's like rubbing two sticks together and eventually then they burn themselves out or whatever. It's like but His Holiness was pointing that out, right? That because if you don't, you know, in other words, it's actually quite true, right? In other words, even somebody who just wants to help themselves, well, if you go around being selfish, right, what happens? Actually, right? People don't like you after a while, right? People avoid you. Even, you know, they even do research now on success in business, right? They used to say selfishness was good for business. They used to. Actually, now when they do research, what the researchers have found, right, is that empathy, actually, people who are empathy are more successful. People who are empathic, rather, are more successful, even in their careers and so on. Of course, in their relationships, right, marriages and parenting and all that, people who are empathic and kind are more successful. But even in business, they found that's true. When they do research on that. So anyway, this was all just like an advertisement for Bodhichitta, right? Like of benefits. So then, we'll do, okay. So I was trying to say which order to do things in, but I want to present one part of bodhicitta, and then we'll have like a little bit of discussion about it. So the idea, one of the ideas implied in bodhicitta, right, is this idea that having developed a sense of love, compassion, and altruism, that the most important thing you can do to help others is to develop yourself, right? Whereas that's the idea of because it's the wish to become enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings, right? And so bodhisattvas, of course, do help others, right? That's clear. But if you look at it, their main training is to develop themselves in order to be more effective in helping others. And I think that can be both interesting and a challenging idea, right? This idea that, so if you want to practice compassion, it means working on your own mind, actually, right? So at the beginning, if you want to develop compassion, even to develop it, it's in your mind, right? And then if you want to express compassion more, of course you may go out and help others some, that's important. But that actually, more important is working on an internal sense of developing your sense, for example, developing qualities of patience, of appreciation, of gratitude, of seeing others in a certain way, right? Seeing others as precious, seeing others as kind, seeing others as important. seeing the faults of selfishness and so on. And so this idea, I guess what I'm presenting is this idea that that one implicit idea in bodhicitta, right, is this idea that that if you want to practice compassion, it means working on yourself, actually, right, and trying to make progress yourself. And I think that can be challenging for anybody, and especially I think in our culture, that can be a challenging idea, right? Because does that, like most people, if I say that, I've noticed if you talk to people, then they think, well, that's selfish, right? Whereas the idea of working on myself seems selfish. Whereas Buddhism is saying, no, that's compassion. Like that's the opposite of selfish, right? Developing your own wisdom, right, is the best way you can be of service to others. And that if you're not wise, and actually I often think this, I mean, there are so many examples of this, I think, where people like, whereas actually I'll make one more explanation about that. It's just this is my own reflection. Up to now I've been presenting Buddhist, but I think this is in line with Buddhism, but I'm just going to present my own reflection on that. One Buddhist teaching is that all things are dependently arisen, right? Interdependent and dependently arisen. And so if you think about the world is filled with these very complex things, right? Whether it's in nature, like ecosystems, or or in nations, right? And for example, the governments and the economic systems of nations, or a forest, or anything is so complicated, actually, right? The ecosystem of an ocean, it's actually much more complicated than human beings. When we try to contemplate that, we're not able to encompass the full complexity, right? So oftentimes you see when somebody goes into a system to try to make it better, the more complicated the system, the more likely it is that if the person's not wise, they actually make it worse, right? And oftentimes that happens, right? Whereas, we live near Washington, so I know about that, right? So many times, like people, like for example, people will spend, the government will spend a huge amount of money to make a difference in a specific country, and then when they do a study after 5 years, they find their effort made things worse, right? And the same thing often happens, right, where somebody goes into an ecosystem, and human beings are famous for this, right? We go into ecosystems and we almost always make them worse, if we intervene a lot, because it takes a lot of wisdom, right, to understand all the relationships. And so part of what I think Buddhism is getting at here is that one has to have more and more wisdom about the nature of interdependent relationships if one wants to be of help. But I guess what I want to suggest, because we always do it, like in these classes, we usually do a little group exercise, so we break up into small groups. And so what I wanted to suggest is this, just for like 10 minutes, if you guys would be willing, let's break up into groups of like 2 or 3. Try to. I know sometimes people go with people. Try to mix it up. Don't always go with the same people, or don't always go with people you've always talked to. And just talk about your relationship to that idea that. So just share a little bit. To reflect back and forth, and then we'll come back as a large group and discuss it, and then we'll go on to other contemplations. But so just to kind of contemplate, what's your personal reaction, right, and for yourself, of this idea that the main way to practice compassion is to train your own mind. And does that go against your habit of thinking that is your habit that the main way of expressing compassion would be to what? What would it be? So to contrast those and just see what your experience is of that, and see if there's something you can take from it that's useful for you right now. Does that make sense? The question, at least. So if there's any way in which that idea that training yourself or working on yourself is the best way to practice compassion, how do you react to that, and is there a way to apply that in your life? So let's just break up into groups of 2, or maybe 3, groups of 3 or so, and just for like 10 minutes. If people can interact around that, and then we'll come back together.
How could I do that right now?
Well, just saying
and how I would apply that in my life, I guess, would be being kind to others, which I have kind of, well, not mean, but I can see sometimes when I do selfishness. So, yeah, I could apply that.
Yeah, I agree. One thing is that how much do you continue to do, where do you cut it off, you know what I'm saying? So that's a very small scale, but I get what you're saying. I think heard water stories like the Peace Corps and all of their big projects going in and like totally devastated the village economy, trying to help and government programs, people say, oh, you hand out too much, but depending on the program, you're not teaching. So it's hard. And so for me, I kind of think I get what you're saying. Practice yourself. You won't struggle so with these decisions. It'll be clear to you that now I should do this, so I shouldn't do that. But I don't know that that means you should just sit at home and meditate and not go out. So not take time with your friends. Like maybe now you can't get that stellar advice that you don't get. But still make sure you have time for your practice. You're not so busy out there doing this and doing that. I haven't meditated for weeks if I'm too busy.
That's true. Those things are important, but what I was saying is that
Strong enough to do that.
and even if you are not seeing it, it's not saying you're suppressed.
Realize that it's part of giving life can be added somehow. Don't let it happen.
They're not just giving, they're You know, if they're trying, if they go to be a service, that is some other designation. But they're not just volunteering, they're using well.
So it's really
Better than
Your batteries are full.
Yeah, I mean,
What's that? So that's what I'm asking. Yeah, you got it. That's the question. That's my question. Is that something, do you think that's something? Is that, that's what I'm getting at exactly. You're right. That's what I was asking.
I want that wisdom, I want to be able, don't you think if you could see that, you would know every single day, like exactly what to do, because you can see the long-term effects of like you did, without that, we're not going to apply.
So many times when you try to think about what actions the effects are going to be, some people overthinking too much, or it can cause headaches. They want to spend so much time thinking about it, but have actually done this thing, kind of get upset about that.
Right, yeah, some people call it, there has to be an action. Yeah.
In a wise way. It helps you too. If you do it right.
It really does take some very strong.
So that's the question.
There's some great foresight, I guess, to be able to
To that Buddhism,
Allow me to get this.
everything's cool. When you let your 5 and 2 or 4 hands on the tether, it's like everything's counted out. And everything's
Reverse,
steps.
yeah.
It's fast, I guarantee you, everyone's steps.
What do you guys do? Because when you study even the description of the
He's already in it.
if they're doing that, of course they care about
They will tell you specifically what integrity is, what they say. And I like that for me.
in their own wisdom.
I like things orderly.
it gives you a map to follow.
Some of the things I used to look into, it's like, they're nice to lofty goals, but they aren't really telling you how to get there. Yeah, I do that. Carry with you.
Yeah, I guess action is really kind of hard to do.
Yeah, we can say, let's all love each other, that doesn't mean we're gonna walk out. We can all agree, it's a great idea, let's do that. And then you get in your car and that first person that cuts you off, you're not loving them.
Yeah, I think it's complicated.
Yeah, so for me, it's good to have the steps. Practice. But I know some people will say, Christianity, we go. Christians,
What you're doing is ultimately, like if you were doing it,
I don't know.
if you weren't even thinking of just doing it for yourself,
So how'd you make it for us?
well, that has to be your job.
In terms of, I saw the Dalai Lama was all about he actually said that's something we should learn.
Okay, let me,
He's talking about
okay, I have
everything.
business, right? Then I need to
He actually said
to make money, where everything else people.
there's a change should be moving out that direction because the focus is on
I'm making, I'm
trying
trying
to go work on yourself and then you'll know that you will do a better job. It's like trying to teach a subject you don't know, right? How well you're going to teach it if you don't learn it first.
I see what you're saying. You're
And
saying
it
their
is
words,
saying
their
that,
thoughts.
you
No,
know,
I'm
you
saying
kind of
it's
have to
selfish.
improve forward
I think it's selfish. I think benefit,
being
I think
active,
it's selfish
being compassionate like that.
to think about yourself.
Surprised me because I
Yeah.
feel like
We have to be teachers
how
now.
so much about get your own and then make it other better.
You know?
Better.
To be more compassionate to others. It's sort of like,
Keep on doing it.
Go too hard. Like business, I want to make money.
Except you hurt
Hard.
somebody.
It's practical. So what's the difference I'm saying?
after works.
Yeah.
Just as meditating. But the difference is
So just another minute or two, and then we'll come back together.
I think the fear is
So the key, when we read up in the
The motivation to practice is ultimately
And I think you also have to like, you try to better yourself, right? And then afterwards, you gotta practice on
right. Yeah.
so you can get better at it. Because otherwise, you're always gonna be in the same, never practice like school, you go to learn something. You never really practice it, you just learn about it until you get there. Yeah.
I do it when he was doing it. No, actually, that was, yeah. That's one thing.
How do you find out on the website?
just found out what's that relation, what's that relation, cost of the affection. No, cost of the.
There's this other
Yeah.
So let's kind of gradually come back together, but also if I want to just, as you do, just think about if there's any either comments or questions from the small groups to the large group before, so we can address those if there are any, and then we'll move on to another contemplation. But yeah, any comments or questions from the small groups?
Well, I think that one thing that always comes up in this discussion, is how far can you give before you become resentful and then you create negative karma. So I think this, learning the fine line between being generous and then being generous to the point that you become resentful, and then it just kind of fire back to you. So in that sense, it comes into play the fact that we have to build our mind first, and like the example of the Bodhisattva who gave his body to the tiger so that the cubs could eat, right? So you don't want to do that, and then not being able to. So I think we have to build our batteries first solid, and then you're able to give. And then it doesn't mean you're not giving, but you're kind of training yourself a little bit at a time in balancing this whole thing.
Yeah, so because actually, I'll just make one comment about that. Like in the, if you read in the definition in the six perfections, right? The first perfection is the perfection of giving, and the perfection of giving, right? They say that, right? And Shantideva is really, the Dalai Lama said that of all the books on the training in compassion and Bodhichitta, actually when I was in India, the Dalai Lama said, he said of all the books ever written, he thinks that's the best on training in the Bodhisattva. For training in Bodhichitta. He said that was in his view, the best book written. But in the definition of the perfection of giving, right, it's the mind. The definition is not. They point that out, right? They say if it were having solved all the poverty in existence, then nobody would be a Buddha yet, right? So that's not the definition. The definition is that it's a mind that's happy to give everything or anything, right? And that would happily give away whatever somebody else wants or needs. And so it's a mental training, right? And I thought it was really, at one time, Ken Rinpoche was teaching on the perfection of giving in Washington, D.C., the center had organized. And he was talking, and he was saying that actually for beginners, it's better actually to train first in mentally giving away and imagining giving. He said because for beginners, if we actually, if we go too quickly to giving away difficult things, then all these problems come, right? The person either starts grasping and saying, "Oh, but I really want that," and "Oh no, I want to give it," and then they start thinking. So first they think, "I want to keep it, but I want to give it," right? Then they start thinking all these. He didn't go into all this detail, but then they start thinking, "Well, are others noticing that I'm giving it, and do I get credit for having given it, and what other people think of me?" And and now do I regret having given it? And and then it becomes this whole problem where you're saying, if somebody first trains in just imagining giving, well, all that doesn't happen, right? Nobody cares. And it was like, you can't have any, you don't get any awards for that. Nobody's going to praise you for that. You can't, and then he was saying, and then eventually once you get better at it, then you can start, I mean, of course we should give as we can, but the point was like that, it's easier for beginners to use their mind, actually. And then as we get better at it, we can give more and more externally. But it's interesting, right, that the Bodhisattva who gave away to his body to the tigress, right, when you read that story, one of the most striking things, he was so happy, right? That he was like, oh, finally I got this chance, like I've been trying to perfect my generosity. And he felt so appreciative to the tigress that this situation arose, and he felt so happy, and he knew that he would go on to that he would be progressing on the path to enlightenment, and he knew that he was already on, they say, the commentary is he was already a first Bhumi Bodhisattva, right? So he already was in control of his rebirth and so on, it was no problem for him. So for him it was quite happy, right? Whereas if somebody does that and then they, like you're describing, freak out and think, oh no, why did I do this? And they start having regret, then it doesn't, right? Then it's better to just do it in imagination or something until they can get to that level. So we have to kind of I guess that's part of what I was getting, is that sometimes we can be too, especially for us beginners, it's important to train our minds. That's really a simple way to put it, right? And that we have, and that whatever we're doing externally should help us in that. And if we're doing something that's making that worse, then that's not helping, right? So if we're pushing too far behaviorally and that it's making our mind worse, then that's not useful. Yeah, other comments, questions? Well, maybe we'll do, what I was saying is this, we still have time, good. So what I want to do is at least start with one of the actual contemplations for developing bodhicitta. And next time we're going to go into the different methods for developing bodhicitta and describe them. But the very first method, the very first contemplation is on equanimity, or even-mindedness, or equal-mindedness, having a steady, even mind towards others. And this one is quite useful, and there are two types of equanimity. This is the common type. We'll get to another time, the uncommon type. But this is just a simple type, let's call it. But the idea is this. I want to start with just this. First of all, this is quite an important training. That's why it comes at the beginning. And actually, everybody has some compassion, right? In other words, even maybe not everybody, but almost everybody has some compassion. Even mass murderers, right? Oftentimes have compassion for their their best friend or something, right? Even dictators oftentimes have love somebody, right? So loving your friends and disliking your enemies is not the goal, and right? Or sometimes and what in Buddhist psychology they often point this out. Whereas if you have the kind of love that says, well, I love this person, so I hate that person because that person's mean to this person. And I like the people who are nice to my, so if this, I love my friend, right? So now anybody who's nice to my friend, I also love them. Anybody who's mean to my friend, then I hate them, right? That's not the kind of love that we're striving to develop, right? But that's the kind of love that oftentimes happens in the world, right? And then that again just makes, right? I mean, that was how that's the same kind of. That's actually not real love, right? That's a kind of attachment that leads to more problems. So what we're talking about is a kind of love that that's steady and even, right? And that can love the person who's harming as well as the person who's helping. That's the kind of love that leads to happiness in the long run. The other kind actually creates more problems. You can see that, right? In other words, because actually then you can just elaborate, right? Whereas actually, at first I only hated the people who were mean to me. Now I hate the people who are mean to this person and that person. So actually you develop, then the more you develop love, the more you develop hatred, actually. It's funny, right? It becomes a little silly, right? So if you say, so for example, even that's true, right? If you start to, it's one thing if you genuinely love your country, that can be positive. But if you say, I love my country, so I hate everybody who's against my country, then that's not helpful, right? Especially in this kind of global world, that creates more problems, actually, right? Whether it's towards your spouse or your nation or your whatever, your gender, your race, your whatever. If you start to say, I love this, so I hate that, that's not the goal. So to counter that, there's this Buddhist training on, there are two types of Buddhist training on equanimity. So I want to start with a simple one. So for this training, I'm just going to go through, since we only have like a half hour, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through it, but you can try to, like, I won't do it like as a sort of formal meditation where we're sitting like this, but it's a contemplative meditation. Does that make sense? You're actually meditating as you do this. But so, and I'm going to present it, there are different ways to present it, but I'll present it kind of the way the Panchen Lama does in Khenchen Rinpoche's the book. That's the first kind. So the Panchen Lama describes it this way. So he says, the Panchen Lama says, so he says, first bring to mind a neutral person, right? So like it could be anybody you don't really know, right? So like somebody you drove by on the way here, right? Or the driver who was in front of you, or now hopefully they weren't your enemy already. If they were going too slow or too fast, then they, but somebody who's neutral. Or it could be the person behind the counter at the 7-Eleven, right? Or the server at the local restaurant, or the person at behind the counter in the doctor's office, whoever, somebody who's neutral, right? And you recognize, first you have to bring up, actually, the Panchen Lama won't go into this much detail, but if you so first you bring up that actually your feeling towards that person, you start to recognize, actually my feeling towards that person is complete indifference, right? And there are people like that, right? I mean, maybe if you're friendly with the person behind the 7-Eleven counter, that doesn't count, but there are certainly people who you feel complete indifference towards, right? And so you bring that up and you notice, wow, I walk by that person as if they were a rock, right? Or a stone, a piece of wood, or something, right? Like I had no noticing of them as of their being, right? As a sentient being, as a person. I just walked by them and didn't feel anything, right? And actually, just that, if you're genuinely trying to cultivate kindness, even actually before you even get to the contemplation, it's a little disturbing to admit to yourself, right? Wow, I felt actually complete indifference to them. Right, so this is the first part of equanimity, is recognizing our indifference to some people. And actually, we're indifferent to most people, right? Actually, if you walk by like the TV, right, and you hear, whatever, 1 million people died and such, and you're thinking, oh, my coffee's getting cold, right? Like that happens every day, right? Or is that we have this attitude of indifference, right? So we start with that, right? We bring up just one person. We take them as the example, right? And we say, okay, I have this attitude of indifference. I actually didn't care. Experientially, the truth is, when I saw that person, I didn't care. I felt complete indifference, as if they were not of any importance. And then we just contemplate a little bit. So you contemplate, wow, so I tend to be indifferent to most people. But, first of all, subjectively, that person wants to be happy as much as I do and wants to not suffer as much as I do. There's not the slightest difference between them and me in how much they want to be happy or in how much they don't want to suffer. Right? And so just that, right, we have to kind of stay with that for a while until it starts to feel, because it's not enough to just notice that intellectually. What you do is you actually sit with that and you think about it for a while until it starts to feel like an inner conflict in you. This inner conflict of, wow, I have this habit of indifference to them, but if I start to empathize with them, they're actually just as important as anybody else, and they have this subjective reality of a whole life, right? And you start to say, wow, I have this indifference, and yet they're the same as me, and the same as the person I love most in the world, right? And then if you keep contemplating, there are many contemplations for this, but I'm just going to share a few, right? Then you think, actually, I'm indifferent to them, but the truth, which is total ignorance, actually. And indifference is a kind of ignorance, right? Not recognizing their subjectivity, not recognizing that they want to be happy and don't want to suffer. Also, my happiness is completely dependent on them, right? I don't even see that. I think they're nothing, right? But actually, if they become enraged, they can destroy my life, right? On the other hand, if they're nice to me, if they do just a few positive interactions, I'm going to label them friend. Whereas, if they went out of their way 2 or 3 times for me, suddenly I would think, oh, they're so wonderful, right? If the person behind the counter, if I didn't have any money or I had just been robbed and they helped me out, suddenly I would think, oh, they're so kind, they're so wonderful, right? On the other hand, if I was out on the street and they suddenly lost their mind and started, smashing into my car or something, then I would think they're terrible. And so my attitude is so ignorant, actually. It doesn't recognize that, first of all, they have their own complete life with a wish for happiness and a wish not to suffer and all their own problems. Secondly, I don't understand my interdependence with them, right? Like that my well-being is totally dependent on them. That if I neglect them, right, and then something bad happens, it could ruin everything, right? On the other hand, they could be very precious to me, and all of that depends just on some little tiny causes and conditions, right? Some little differences of causality, of like, and relationship, right? Little changes, and then all that changes, right? Then over time, actually, I can also think, right? Like this person, I felt indifferent. Right? Then I remember back. For me, it brings to mind a friend, it brings to mind somebody who I met, who for a long time I used to see and had felt that complete indifference, and then at a certain point, he became my closest friend, right? And I think, wow, like that can happen, right? Experientially, I know it because we've all had those experiences, right? You walked by somebody and you thought you didn't even notice they existed; they were almost nothing. Then there came a point where they were your best friend. Now that person, I don't even know them, right? Now they're a stranger almost, like. And you say, wow, like these things change, actually. These categories that I lump people into are nothing substantial. It's just some kind of a, like, habit of mine. That's actually an egocentric habit, right? My habit is if they're not giving me something and helping me, then I don't care about them. If they're helping me, then I suddenly think they're wonderful. If they harm me, then I think they're terrible. It's a totally egocentric habit of viewing people in that way, right? Whereas some wisdom, as I think about this person, right, actually they just want to be happy, they don't want to suffer, right, and they're the same as me in that way. They're the same as everybody else, right? So you start to challenge your own perception of indifference until you develop a sense of openness to them, in a sense. Openness without grasping and without aversion, right? That you're kind of open to them, you're noticing them, you're appreciating them, but you don't have a sense of attachment to them, wanting something from them, right, egocentrically. And you also don't hate them or dislike them. But you kind of do not, so you're switching from indifference to a kind of even-minded openness. Does that make sense? Then next, you bring to mind somebody, and actually if you do this, right, bring to mind somebody you're really attached to, right? Like where you would feel if they died, that the world would be horrible, it would be horrible, right? It would be a terrible loss if they died, right? And then actually first you can think, well, why do I think it would be a terrible loss if they died but not that indifferent person? Like if that indifferent person died, and then somebody told me, like if I walked into the store and I said, actually I wouldn't even ask, where were they, right? If somebody else was behind the counter next week, right? I wouldn't say, where's so-and-so, right? They would be dead and I wouldn't even ask, right? I wouldn't notice maybe, right? Or maybe I would vaguely notice and not even think about it, right? And if the person said, if by some coincidence I overheard somebody else asking, and the person said, oh, so-and-so died, I took their shift, I wouldn't think anything much, right? I wouldn't have much thought about it. And so you ask yourself, I'm elaborating, this isn't all details in the contemplation, right? But I ask yourself experientially, so why am I grasping at this person so strongly and indifferent to that person? Like, and if you look at it honestly, right? So I have this grasping at this person, right? It's just because they serve my ego some, right? In other words, they do things I want. They say things to me that I want to hear, and they do things in relation to me that I like, right? So I have this feeling of they're more important than everybody else because they do these things to me, right? Because actually that person behind the counter does those things for somebody else, right? It's just they don't do it for me, so I don't care about them, right? This person does those for me, so I care about this person. And you start to realize, well, that's just temporary. First of all, that's temporary, right? Another is it's completely egocentric, right? Another is that it's also a little bit childish, actually, right? Like, so I really feel like, and you look, right? Actually, this is experience. So you think of that person and you look at your own mind, right? And in your mind, if you check honestly with yourself, what you'll see is when you imagine that person's face here in front of you, you feel, oh, they're so wonderful. The feeling is like they out there are so wonderful as compared to these other people, right? And what you start to realize is, or they're like so precious, right, compared to these other people. And what you start to realize is, first of all, like you feel that's there from the side of the person, you don't recognize that it's just because they were nice to you a few times, right? And if you look honestly in the world, right, so say this, like, you don't recognize that changes, right? In other words, if I do that, right, I think, oh, I feel this way towards this person. Oh, I really feel so strongly, right? I have no awareness that that's like, it's a little bit like, if you're on the playground, if you go on a playground and you see kids, right? And then somebody touches this one kid's toy, right? So the kid likes the other kid. Then somebody touches the toy and the kid goes, leave me alone, you're no good, right? And they start screaming, But then the next day, if that same kid comes up and says, oh, I have 3 lollipops, want one? Then they say, oh, you're my best friend, And if we as adults look at that, we think, wow, how, like, it's a little funny, right? It's like childish. But actually, we're the same. What this contemplation is saying is, I am exactly like them. It's just a little bit longer term. It's not one day. It's a few months, right, or a few years. Because you look at people though, like, and again, if you're kind of like, so I look at this friend and I think, oh, they're wonderful, right? But then, if you've ever been to a wedding, right? People on their wedding day, they look at their spouse, and it's just that, like, it's that on steroids, right? It's like this, oh wow, they're the most wonderful, and they make speeches, right? And then if you go to court, divorce court, right? Then what do you hear? Exact opposite, right? They're the worst. Like, it depends on the gender, the what's the word? If it's the wife speaking or the husband speaking, which metaphors they use, right? Like, I won't repeat them here, but but it's true, right? Like there is, but the same thing happens between nations, right? Like, whereas if you read it's actually so silly, right? If you read like the descriptions of the British, right, during the if you read from like old newspaper accounts of descriptions of the British in the American Revolutionary War, right? And then you read like descriptions of Japanese people during World War II, right? Now those are both American allies who now, it's wonderful and all that. But if you read I'm just giving an example from American point of view, same thing from every country has its thing, right? It's like so silly, actually, right? It's like, it's the same as the children, right, on the playground. This thing of like, oh, they're evil and they're terrible and they're oppressive and they're like horrible and they barbarians or whatever, like you use these different terms, right? But actually we're the same, right? We do that whether it's on a national level, whether it's in a marriage, in a friendship, right? We're so childish that we totally believe that it's true, whatever, that now it's, oh, they're the greatest, right? Then if the circumstances change, we would say they're the worst person, the most horrible person, right? All they have to do is a few bad things to us, right? It's true, our best friend, like, all they have to do is a few things that we find horrible, and you'll be telling everybody how terrible they are, actually, right? You're just like that child on the playground. So you contemplate like that experientially, and the goal here is applying it to yourself, right? So I contemplate like that experientially until I say, wow, like, there is a reality that this person wants to be happy and doesn't want to suffer, right? That's true. Right? There is a reality this person is a subjective being with their own life. But this feeling of attachment I have to them, like exaggerating their preciousness and importance, is just an egocentric, childish projection, right? And you try to develop, you work with it until you can develop the same feeling you had toward, so then you can imagine the person you were indifferent towards and your cherished friend. And even-mindedness means, it doesn't mean you don't recognize the difference, right? Like in other words, okay, this person's my, friend of 20 years and this person's somebody I haven't spoken to much, right? There's a external reality, of course, we're not denying that, but you start to recognize my projections are silly though, until you start to feel, yes, they're my old friend, but the reality, like I know everything changes, but I still cherish them and I'm open to them. That's that feeling of openness and of evenness and of calmness. You try to see if you can get to that with the stranger and the friend. Does that make sense? Until you can experientially feel a sense of openness to this person, a sense of acceptance of them, but without all that grasping and without the exaggeration. Does that make sense? And when the exaggeration arises, you recognize it in your experience as childish. And you kind of say, okay, it's a habit I have, but it's not true, right? It's like some kind of a childish projection. Don't trust that anymore. You see what I mean? And you slowly like kind of distance from that and calm that down so that you're, like if you imagine you're like even-mindedness, maybe we started like this, our mind, and then eventually we get like that, and then like this, it doesn't come immediately until maybe we start to get like that. And again, it's not denying, you don't become psychotic, right? It's not like if you walk up to a stranger who you've never met before, you start hugging them and crying, I'm so happy to see you. It's not that. And you don't go up to your best friend and say, who are you? I never met you before. That's not even-mindedness. In other words, you recognize the conventional realities of relationships and roles, but you also see beyond that, right? It's how the Dalai Lama can go to a town that he's never been to, right, and say, hello, my brothers and sisters, right, and feel the sense of warmth. You see him with somebody he's never met before, right, and you see the sense of warmth and of openness as if he's with his best friend, right, and he makes the other person feel like they're his best friend, right, but that's because he's already trained his mind in this equanimity, and then in the other kind of equanimity too, which cherishes others, everybody equally like family. Right, so he's already done that. So that's why he can go around and feel that way towards everybody. And everybody is like a friend to him. But he doesn't have friends who he's willing to kill somebody over either, right? Whereas, because that's even-mindedness, right? Whereas that, like, if we were in his shoes, or I'm just taking him as the example, right? If we were in the Dalai Lama's shoes, right, then we would feel that he's the head of the Tibetan people, right? The leader, he's no longer the political, he stepped down as that, but he's the spiritual and moral head of the Tibetan people still. And for how long? Over 50 years, I think he was the political head, right? Any normal person who hasn't developed equanimity, right, then they would feel, these are my countrymen, and I want to kill the enemies, right, the Chinese. Now, of course, there are more Chinese people than any other, so what a horrible idea that would be, right? It's the most populous country, right? But my point is like, the Dalai Lama doesn't think that, right? Because he's developed this kind of even-mindedness, right? He loves and cares for and takes care of Tibetan people, he plays his appropriate role, right? But he also says, even the communist leaders of China, not just the ordinary Chinese, even the leaders, the communist leaders, he says, it's also temporary, right? Like in other words, they're not some inherently existent enemy. They're not like some permanent enemy. They're just caught in some role that's in relation to this, and that'll change, right? Just like our relationship to, Japan, Americans' relationship to Japan changed a lot from 1940s to today. But we ordinarily don't recognize that, and somebody does something, and we get totally caught in our projection. But I want to give one more. So there's two more steps to this contemplation, right? So you would keep using these different reasonings, but you get the idea here. This is not an intellectual exercise; it's an emotional exercise, right? So you have to actually bring up this feeling of indifference until you feel, wow, I'm that indifferent. Actually, I'm that uncaring. And then towards my friend, right? I'm that attached. Like because ordinarily we don't admit it to ourselves, but you realize, wow, like I really have this feeling of like when I see them, oh, they're so good, and compared to this person, I don't care, but this one's so precious. Like you start to feel the difference, and then you work with it until you can feel more even. Does that make sense? But then the third step is you bring to mind an enemy, right? And you imagine that person there. And for the exercise, you start with one, right? So just as a cat, because if you make it too general, you don't feel it, right? So that's why. So you bring to mind one friend. If you thought, oh, all my friends, it's not going to be as visceral at first. So then you bring to mind an enemy, and it could be a personal enemy, like somebody who has done something recently that really bothered you. And if you can't think of a personal enemy, then you think of somebody where if you see their face, like then you can think of somebody famous or somebody. It could be like somebody who represents values you don't like, like whatever in our culture, or it could be, an enemy of your, so it could be like anybody you feel aversion towards, right? So it could be somebody who politically you think, oh, just you see them, right? If they were to come on, like you think of it this way, like one is a real person in your life, like every day, right, who did something that hurt you or bothered you. But you can think of somebody where, like, if you imagine being in a room and somebody, if you can't think of them at that moment, right? If you don't have a personal enemy at the moment, think of somebody where if you were going to be stuck watching a TV show for an hour where that person was going to lecture and talk for an hour straight, you would think, oh, get them off, I can't stand it. Let's say they represent a political view that you can't stand, or they represent an ideology in the world, right? It could be, anywhere in the world that you really dislike, right? So that when you see their face, you think, oh, I don't want that. I wish they didn't, just disappear, right? That's the feeling that arises. That's that feeling of aversion for the enemy. And then again, you do the same contemplation, right? In other words, so you think, well, first of all, at one time, that enemy was a stranger for sure, right? Whereas if I hadn't heard something about them or if they hadn't done something to me, then in the past, they were a total stranger where I felt the total indifference to them. So then why do I feel this intense aversion to that person, that when I see their face, I feel there's something out there that's terrible? And why is that? It's just because, it's because they disagree with me, right? It's totally self-centered, right? And it's actually a little hard to admit to ourselves if we really start to contemplate it. Like, because it's not just that I'm childish in that, right? Whereas it's just some temporary conditions, you know, and so we say this, but also, like, I guess here's what I'm getting at, is like usually we try to justify it in our mind, like we think, well, I'm good and they're bad, right? Because we never think I'm the one who's wrong and they're right. In other words, you never think about your enemy, they're right and I'm wrong, right? But actually they never think that about, well, one is they never think that about you either, right? But somebody's wrong. So is the assumption that I'm right 100% of the time and everybody else is wrong? Well, that's questionable, right? As I start to contemplate this, right? And so I start to think, well, and also there are lots of people who would agree with them, and who do agree with them, and who look at me and think, what a jerk, right, to disagree with that person. Or what a bad person, right? And then also, if conditions change just a little, right, then I'll totally be cherishing that person and thinking they're the most wonderful, right? And that happens all the time, actually. Again, like if you contemplate it, these things happen all the time where the person who somebody hates the sight of, then they can't live without, right? And actually those examples I gave of the wars were like that, right? In other words, where people thought, because it was the other side in the war, then people thought, oh, they're terrible. Then peace comes, and then, you know, a few years later, it's like they're the most cherished one, right? But actually, like, oftentimes, actually, if you check, like actually if you look at your own experience, you check for real people in your life, actually sometimes it's just this, like if their mouth went like that, then I like them. If their mouth went like that, then I didn't like them. You know, it's like sometimes it's totally silly. Like actually you look, and like around here, right, you can pick the example of driving, right? Like so if somebody like does something when you're driving and then you think, oh, they're really bad, right? But actually then if you check, right, for sure that person, you know, they could just do something else and then you think they're wonderful, they let you in, then they're great. You know, then also, if you, this one's quite useful. Have you ever done the thing they did? You know, well, just ask yourself that, right? Well, so, but I cherish myself and not them, right? The point is you keep contemplating until you start to realize, just like the stranger, this is just somebody who wants to be happy and doesn't want to suffer, right? And who's doing their best from their perspective, with their worldview, to be happy and not suffer, right? And it just so happens that their efforts are going against my efforts, and so I'm labeling them a certain way, right? But it's just a label. And then finally, once you get to that point, then you can imagine like all beings, actually, or many beings, you know. And you start to contemplate. So first you start with one example of each. Does that make sense? Enemy, friend, stranger. Stranger, friend, enemy. And then you start to broaden it out and think of all beings. And you start to think, wow, everybody I meet is the same, right? Actually, everywhere I go, people want to be happy. Everybody I come across doesn't want to suffer. And you start to like, I sometimes personally think of this as like trying to grow up, actually, right? Like, whereas immature people like sort of live in these projections, right? Where we're always kind of reacting to others and viewing them as some kind of concrete friend, enemy, and stranger. And here we're trying to like emotionally and spiritually grow up, actually, and sort of recognize reality, that everybody's the same in basic ways. We're all the same in that we're going to die, right? We're all the same in that we're changing moment to moment. We're all the same, and everything about us is changing moment to moment, right? So if you hold on to some idea, if I hold on to some idea, this person is permanently like this, actually that person's not permanently anything, right? Their ideas are changing moment to moment. Their cells are changing, actually you can't measure how fast, right? If you try to imagine just the changes going on in their brain in a second, right? How many neurons are firing, and then their heart's beating, and they're, like, what is there that's solid that I'm holding on to as a permanent friend, enemy, or stranger, right? Everything about that person, their ideas are changing every second. Isn't that true? Whereas yours are, right? Whereas like things are going through your mind one after another after another. You may have certain patterns, but even those patterns change over time, right? As you get older, you think about other things. And like, there's nothing solid about anybody, actually, right? Whereas we're all changing. We're all impermanent. We're all not just grossly impermanent in the sense that we're going to die, but impermanent moment to moment, actually, is our nature. And so we start to grow up, actually, through this contemplation of equanimity, and we start to see others as, for what they are, which are impermanent creatures, beings that want to be happy and don't want to suffer, and are kind of, due to ignorance, bouncing around in life, making all kinds of mistakes and doing their best. Right? And so then so what happens if you develop equanimity and then somebody does something you don't like? Right? Well, I'm not, at this level of practice, it's not that we're saying, oh, you're totally fine and you're at peace, but you start to have a kind of calmness about it, right? You recognize, well, of course they did that, right? Like, that's what happens in life, right? I'm on this planet, it's not their fault. Like, everybody on this planet has that happen all the time. That's the nature of life on this planet, and that's always going to happen, too, on this planet. You know what I mean? As long as they're human beings, people are going to do things that the others don't like. So you don't overreact anymore. Does that make sense?
So how do you treat people though? If you boy or your friend before, do you treat them the same?
I think the idea would be this, if it's grounded in a recognition that people want to be happy and don't want to suffer, then the idea would be that you treat others more respectfully, actually, right? Because even the friends, actually, if you think about the friend in this category, what we're getting at is the friend, we're overly attached to them, actually, right? So actually, what happens with friends? If you're in that kind of friendship, right? I think our behavior actually improves even towards our friends. First of all, of course, we're nicer to strangers, right? If you do this contemplation, you're going to become much nicer and smile more and be more friendly to strangers. And with your enemies, they'll be relieved, right? Because in other words, if you don't do this contemplation, you just think they're evil and you treat them terrible, right? If you do this contemplation, you start to be a little more empathic to them. So your enemies will get a big relief if you do this. But your question is fair. What about friends, right? But actually, friends also are better off, right? Because the reality is with this kind of friendship, right? Friendship that's grounded in attachment, like what happens, right? Somebody does something I like, and so I start to be their friend, right? And they do something else I like, so then I say, oh, they're my good friend. Right? And then I have them in that rigid category, and then I expect them to behave towards me always the same way, right? And then my friend starts to say something that I don't like, right? Because they're a real person with complex, right? And then I start to go, wait a second, you're not supposed to think that. You're supposed to be my friend. You're supposed to agree with me about everything. What are you doing, And like I start to pressure my friends subtly, right? We all do this. I mean, we start to pressure our friends to try to be a certain way, right? And we start to like expect our friends and put out an expectation on them. Well, they should agree with me on politics. They should agree with me on religion. They should agree with me on values. They should agree with me on what I want to do on Saturday. They should agree with me on, right? Like we start to pressure them. Whereas with this attitude, you actually develop a more calm, even-minded approach. And then also, let's say the friend disappoints you sometime, right? If you've not done this kind of contemplation much in your life, right? Then you're like, oh, I'm so hurt, I'm so disappointed. How could you be like that? Oh, like that, right? Whereas if you've done this, what do you do? Actually, in other words, what you do is you say, all right, that's what happens, of course. Like, right? That's to be expected. Don't worry about it. It's okay. I'm still here for you. Like you have that kind of attitude. So it's like a more mature attitude. So. And you have a commitment to the friends, right? It's not that you don't, if somebody's been kind to you, repay their kindness, right? But actually, in this contemplation, you recognize everybody's your friend, though, because everybody's been kind to you, actually. Sometimes you don't recognize it. Actually, the person behind the counter was incredibly kind to you. They gave you something, they let you have something by being there, right, that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And so on. And, so the idea here, and the person who cuts in front of you when you're on the way to work and you're upset or something, actually, he's probably incredibly kind. Where are they going? Well, most likely they're going to work also, right? Around here, they're probably going to do something for the, like, whatever. Let's assume, some department of the government or something like that where you need their help, actually. You need them to get to work. So the point is like you recognize everybody's been kind to me. And so I owe everybody a debt of gratitude. And so, like, towards your friends, you have less expectations, but you start to develop that sense of appreciation and gratitude to everyone, in a sense. Does that answer the question? So it's not that you don't, that you don't consider your friends anymore or something like that. But you don't put as much expectations on them, right? Because you recognize that also things change and people change, right? Like, it's hard, right? Like sometimes if our friend starts to develop an interest that we disagree with, right? We can be, or our family member or, whoever, like we could become quite upset, right? Oh no, they're growing apart from me, right? And again, that's like a little silly, right? Like in other words, they're their own person. And we have to accept that they're trying to be happy, right, and trying not to suffer, and they're using their best wisdom to do that. So it's this kind of sense of appreciation and valuing of the other, what's the way to say it, as from their own subjectivity as somebody who wants to be happy and doesn't want to suffer. And I guess before we stop, so people get the sense of that, though, of that contemplation. So the goal there is like, you get it. It's not, to be clear, I just want to be 100, I hope it should be clear now. The goal is not to develop indifference towards everybody, right? Like you don't start with indifference towards strangers and then say, well, I just want to be indifferent to everybody. That's not the goal. The goal is to develop a kind of empathic, accurate perception of others that's not grounded in projections, right? And childish projections about just how they treat you, so that, like, so that if the friend suddenly cursed at you, you wouldn't think, oh, now they're terrible, right? And if the enemy suddenly was nice to you, you wouldn't, like, in other words, you recognize there are categories. It's not, these are labels in the world, but they're not, what's I say? They're not permanent, but also they're not real from the other person's side. They're only like, there's nothing about them that makes them truly an enemy, right? Actually, our worst enemy has lots of people who label them friend, so it's not, there's nothing about them, it's just me labeling that. And so you start to like view it as not terribly important, actually, those labels. But okay, so that's the meditation, that's a way of contemplating equanimity, which is the beginning of cultivating bodhicitta in terms of actual practice. So maybe next time when we start, I know it's going to be a few weeks, but when we start next time, maybe we'll actually do that meditation as the beginning, and after the breathing one, we'll actually do the equanimity meditation together.